Welcome to the Mindful Rebel podcast, y'all. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you. My name is Sean Moore, and of course, I'm your host for the podcast. Now, as we begin the podcast, I know you're probably like, who's the interview guest? I'm doing something a little different this year for 2025, and I'm going to weave in some podcast episodes where I'm just talking directly to you and sharing some of my thoughts, right? We're still going to have the interviews with some amazing guests, but I also wanted to share a little bit more about what I think, right? I've gotten the feedback that people are like, cool, like the interview. But what do you think about things? Or what is it that you want to share? And so I'm going to do a little bit more of that this year. And today's podcast is actually an example of that. Now, with that, we're going to dive into a topic that is, I think, absolutely fundamental to the idea of self-inquiry and personal discovery. And really, that's the art of holding space. So, before we dive in fully, I want to share something. Recently I've been developing curriculum for my Chill So Hard Yoga Nidra and Restorative Yoga training. And then also just revisiting some of my current offerings and trainings like my meditation teacher training, energy and sound healing training, and other programs that I've developed. And really sort of been in this space of retooling and reworking some of that curriculum. Even with that, I've been sort of sitting with the idea of what it means to hold space. Because for me, as I sit with that idea, I realize that's kind of the connective tissue between all of the work, right? I've been integrating and working more with leadership theory and research and seeing how that really can be integrated into the stillness-based work. And really, I see that holding space is that thread, right? It's kind of been revealed to me that it's this bridge between contemplative practices and modern leadership approaches, right? Or at least effective, equitable leadership approaches. So we hear the concept of holding space so often, but what do we mean by holding space? I think that Heather Plett describes it perfectly. She says, holding space is about walking alongside another person in whatever journey they're on without judging them, without making them feel inadequate or trying to fix them or trying to impact the outcome. Now think about that for a moment. It's not really about being a fixer or having an answer. It's really about being a witness or even just a supportive presence. So today in this podcast, I want to share 5 essential questions that we can begin to ask ourselves when we're in a position of holding space for others. Now, I think this works, whether you're a yoga teacher, whether you're an energy healer, a life coach, educator, or some social impact leader, right? These questions can be super helpful. They've really helped transform my own personal practice, and I believe they can do the same for you. So let's get into it. Let's get it popping, my friends. Question 1. Am I grounded, resourced, and at ease? Now, this is where it all begins. If we are not grounded ourselves, how can we possibly create a stable space for others? Before you step into holding space for someone, check in with yourself. Are you creating space to engage in your own practices that ground you? Are you taking those deep breaths? Are you engaging in pranayama or your own energy healing practices? Are you pouring back into your own cup? Is this a space where you can notice that if there's tension in your own body, and creating space to help release that? But to take that a step further, it's not just about being calm, right? It's also about being resourced. Are you in a good place emotionally and energetically to hold space for somebody else? Sometimes the most mindful thing we can do is to recognize when we're not in the right state to hold space for anybody else. Sometimes that means we got to sit down and go tend to our own needs in that moment. Question number 2. Am I listening without an agenda? Now, this one is kind of a tricky one. We're so conditioned to want to help, to fix, to offer solutions, and quite often we're incentivized to do that, right? And sometimes sitting in a space without an answer actually feels a bit uncomfortable. But when we're truly holding space, it requires us to let go of our own agenda, even if that agenda comes from a space of love. We're often looking for an answer because we care about the people that we're holding space for, right? We're like, hey, I want to help you solve whatever quote unquote problem I see in front of you. But when you're creating space for someone to share something personal with you, or when you're moving through a journey with somebody, You got to slow down and notice if your mind's already jumping to solutions, or even if you're just preparing what to say next. That's really not listening, right? You're waiting to talk. So real listening happens with our whole body in full presence. It's about creating space where the other person and their truth can unfold naturally without any sort of interference. Question 3. Am I comfortable with silence? Woo. This has always been a big one for me. In our noisy filled world, and I say we as in me, we've lost touch with the power of silence. And this is something that I have to consciously work with and work towards. But when we're holding space, we got to remind ourselves that silence is not empty. It's actually very pregnant with possibility. Silence is actually where the integration happens. It's where people can sink deeper into their own truth and reconnect to their own sense of inner wisdom and personal power. Now, how do we get comfortable with silence? We actually have to sit in silence and be in silence with ourselves. We have to build a more gentle and a more compassionate relationship with silence. In that silence, we can really compassionately notice our impulse to fill it and then don't, right? Remember, our deepest moments of healing happen in these quiet spaces between words. Question 4. Am I judging their experience? Now, this is where our practice of mindfulness really comes into play. Notice when judgment arises, and it's going to arise, right? Judgment is going to happen. We're human, right? And the fact of the matter is, when we're working with folks, whether we're holding space in a movement practice, we're coaching, we're leading a team, people are going to make decisions that we would not make, right? The key is never to have judgments, or the key is not to never have judgments, right? The key is to notice them and consciously set them aside. We got to remind ourselves that someone else's journey doesn't need to make sense to us. Their feelings don't need to seem reasonable to us. Our role in holding space is really to create an environment of total acceptance where they can be exactly as they are and make decisions and learn in a way that unfolds for them naturally. Now, question 5, and this is the last question. Probably the toughest of the questions, at least for me, I can say. Am I maintaining boundaries? So this is where many of us sort of struggle. This is our work. This is probably our space of practice. Holding space doesn't mean taking on someone else's emotional baggage. I'm going to say that one more time for the people in the back. Holding space doesn't mean taking on someone else's baggage, someone else's emotional baggage, right? It doesn't also mean being available 24/7. It doesn't mean absorbing their pain, right? Good boundaries actually make us better at holding space because they keep us grounded and they prevent burnout. We got to pay attention to our own energy levels. We also have to be clear about what we can and cannot offer. Remember that true support means empowering others to find their own way, not carrying them. This also means knowing when you're potentially out of your own depth and being able to share resources for further exploration if that person welcomes that. So as we wrap up today's episode, I invite you to explore these questions in your own practice. The next time you begin a meeting or are heading to lead a sound bath class or maybe even working with a coaching client, before you get there, sit with each one of these questions. Notice what comes up for you, what might feel like a challenge, what feels actually good or natural for you to lean into. But you want to create space to really explore these questions and be honest with yourself on where you are with these 5 questions. We got to remember that holding space is both an art and a practice. We get better at it by doing it skillfully, by checking in with ourselves and using these questions, and by continuously learning from our own experiences. So thank you all for tapping in for this first of many podcasts structured this way. Hopefully this was helpful. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who might benefit from it. Also, do all the subscribing things, Subscribe, like, share, all the things to sort of help signal boost this podcast. Until next time, may you all move into the rest of your day with a greater sense of peace, clarity, and freedom. Thank you, beautiful people. Talk to y'all soon.